Have you ever wondered if you're codependent or narcissistic? That's what this video is about, because if you can understand the concept and how it applies to you in your relationships, you're going to be able to do the right healing because you're going to know what the problem is and what the solution is. But first, my name is Michelle Ferris and I'm a psychotherapist and I love helping people create relationships that work. So people have asked me, are codependents and narcissistic people similar? There is two things that make them similar. Both people who are codependent and narcissistic tend to struggle with an undefined sense of self. They don't have a strong sense of themselves, which is why they look to other people to fill that gap. Now, they do it in a different way. Codependents do it in a way that they are trying to get other people to like them by helping, by fixing, by focusing on other people. So the codependent person focuses totally on what other people need and what other people want to their own expense. Whereas the narcissistic person focuses on what they need and they're very consumed by what works for them, not so much what works for other people. But the important thing that I really want to stress as I'm starting this talk is that there's a continuum. So you can be somewhat codependent, moderately codependent, and severely codependent. You can have narcissistic traits that really get in the way and are pretty severe, up to you can have a personality disorder called narcissistic personality disorder, where it's very rigid and it does not change over time, even with therapy. So I'm saying that because it's really important to notice where you fall. This is not an either or scenario. Some people, if they're mildly codependent, they may have trouble setting boundaries. They may have trouble putting their needs first. But when it really matters, they can do that. They can take care of themselves and they are not a doormat. They don't sacrifice themselves continuously for other people. Now, if you're codependent on the severe end, then you look completely at other people for your value and your worth. You can't be alone. You tend to get addicted to people. You have very little sense of self, okay? And it's a really hard way to live. But sometimes we find ourselves in that category. Now, on the narcissistic scale, if you just have narcissistic traits, okay, because a lot of people say, oh, my partner is narcissistic. Well, you know what? The full-blown narcissistic personality disorder, that's only about 5% of the population. It's pretty rare. But narcissistic traits at the lower end is what you might be thinking about. And that's when you have a partner or someone in your life that tends to be more self-centered, but they can also still have a relationship with you. You can still get some of your needs met, okay? Now, if it's medium and you're in the middle of narcissism, then you're noticing a lot more traits. You're noticing that they can't have much empathy for when other people are hurt. They can't compromise. They have a really hard time acknowledging other people's pain. And when it's a full-blown disorder, then these are the people who are highly abusive, tend to rage whenever they're challenged, and really have a hard time fulfilling and maintaining healthy relationships. In fact, it's near impossible for them because their personality style is so rigid that they cannot tolerate seeing any of their own defects as a problem. So full-blown narcissists are not going to land in therapy unless they think it's going to get them what they want, okay? So as you can hear in what I'm saying, there's a big range here, and that's what I want you to consider. Now, how is the codependent person different than the narcissist? So here's one fundamental difference is the codependent person feels a lot, okay? They can almost feel other people's feelings. They're so empathetic. The narcissistic person feels only for themselves. They can't understand or put themselves in another person's shoes. They don't understand why someone else is hurting because they're totally focused on themselves. Another example might be a codependent has a really hard time setting boundaries or saying no because they want to be liked and they want to avoid conflict. The narcissistic person has no problem saying no, and they are able to set boundaries, and actually they tend to violate other people's boundaries because they don't see them as important as their own. So the codependent person tends to struggle with a lot of self-doubt. They don't trust their own perceptions because they've learned over time, especially in childhood, that their needs and their feelings weren't considered important. So they grew up with a lot of self-doubt and they question themselves a lot. Whereas the narcissistic person grew up and they had either an inflated sense of self that caused them to believe that their way was right. Okay, and there's lots of different reasons for that. The narcissistic person thinks that they're right and they don't understand someone else having a different opinion. So they tend to have too much of a sense of self, whereas the codependent tends to have less of a sense of self. And this is where the gaslighting comes in. The codependent person will doubt their reality and that narcissist thinks they're right. So they're going to convince the codependent person through gaslighting that their point of view is wrong. Okay. So when we're talking about the codependent and narcissistic relationship, they tend to fit together because they're the opposite sides of the same coin. And one question I get a lot is my addict or alcoholic narcissistic? And I learned something really interesting is that many addicts and alcoholics do appear to have some narcissistic traits, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they're full-blown narcissistic, because when they get sober, that's when you may want to look at that again. Because when you're addicted to substances, you are more self-centered, you are more self-focused because you're doing everything you can to sustain the addiction so you can survive. But in recovery, sometimes those tendencies go away and that it actually uncovers more of a codependent personality type, not a narcissistic type. So I think it's really important when we look at narcissism to be careful of the label, because again, not that many people have full-blown narcissistic disorder. And when we label our family and friends narcissist, it's not going to go very well. They're going to not like it. But for you, the reason sometimes these labels get talked about is that they provide really good information that you can use to navigate your relationship. So if you tend to attract narcissistic people, that's really good information for you, because what you're going to want to do is you're going to want to look at how you can start to address your codependency and start to see if you can attract healthier people that are not so self-centered. Or maybe they're not so far down the scale. If you have attracted really severe narcissism in your life, you want to go more towards the middle, where someone maybe has a narcissistic tendency but can still tolerate a relationship and can still give you what you need to a certain degree. Because most of us are going to be one or the other. I myself am definitely in the codependent realm, but I've had to really assess the narcissistic part of who I attract. And over time in recovery, that gets better. The goal of recovery is health. And the goal of this codependency recovery and narcissism recovery is balance. So how do you know if this applies to you? Really, a simple way is to ask yourself, do you wake up in the morning and immediately think of what you need to do for others? Or do you immediately think of what you need for yourself? Because if that's kind of a general baseline, but if that's how you live, that's the start of how you can start to see which camp you fall in. And again, we don't want to judge ourselves for being in the codependent camp or the narcissism camp, because we all have certain tendencies based on our childhood and how we grew up that we're really powerless over. And what I want to support you to do is to do your healing. And I have a relationship checklist to help you assess the quality of your relationships today. Because if you know where your relationships stand right now and where the gaps are, that's where your work is. So if you understand that I tend to attract selfish people and they tend not to treat me well, that's important information, because as you start in your recovery, you're going to want to undo that, and you're going to want to unpack that and notice where you can start to attract healthier people who are more respectful. So I hope this video has been helpful. Thanks so much.